right. Yes. Hello. Good morning, everybody. I'm Parecki from Okta. Excited to be here to talk about the state of OAuth. I do a lot of work at Okta around education around OAuth and OpenID Connect. I have various materials on range of those topics, a video course, a book, things like that. But I also actually participate in the IETF, which is where the OAuth specs are made, and that is where it's where all the work is done, and that's most of what we're going to be focusing on today. So you might be familiar with OAuth from its use in buttons like these: sign in with Facebook, sign in with Google. Is this OAuth? Kind of yes, kind of no. This wasn't really the original use or original goal of OAuth, but this is kind of how it's ended up being used a lot in practice today. So originally, OAuth was made to solve a particular problem, which was to solve these kinds of screens that were happening all over the place before we had OAuth. This would be like a new app launching and saying, I would like to access your contact list, which is in your email address, and in order to do that, please give me the password to your email account. And then this application would go log into your email account and download all your contacts. Now, we understand today that this is not good, and everybody here has done a lot of work to make this go away, and in various ways. But what we can't do is prevent people from wanting this end result of sharing this data with these applications. So ideally, if we can't stop people from wanting to share data because these apps are promising to do useful things for them, we would like to have a way where users can safely share data with third-party apps while preventing access to other parts of the account that they don't need. So Yelp is asking for access to contacts, but Yelp doesn't actually need to access your actual emails. This is so this was how OAuth was originally trying to, what it was originally created to solve. It was created to solve third-party application access to data. This is actually kind of analogous to checking into a hotel, where you go to the front desk, you show your ID and credit card, and you get back this room key. This room key doesn't represent you or your identity. It represents your access to certain resources in the hotel. And this is analogous to OAuth, where this key card, it's an access token. The access token represents access to data, not necessarily representing you as a person. And that key card may let you access one or more things. Like at a hotel, you have your door, you have the front door, you have the room to the gym or the pool or whatever. So this is really what OAuth was originally set out to solve. And OAuth was a collection of specs over a long period of time to solve that access to data. So what it looks like is if you are using an application and you click the connect or log in with or share whatever button that is, you're going to actually get moved away from the application over to the OAuth server. You're going to sign in there, and that's where you would enter your password, and that's where you do your multi-factor step-up authentication and things like that. And eventually you get redirected back to the application. So nowhere in this flow did you ever share your password with the application. You only are sharing the password with the OAuth server where the password lives. And now that we are moving away from passwords, the same thing continues to be true with the passwordless methods like we just heard about passkeys. Another really important part of OAuth in particular was this idea of asking the user for permission when it's a third-party application. So if you go through a flow from Facebook where Facebook is trying to access contacts in your Google account, as a user, you will see a screen like this, which is saying, Facebook would like to access this data in your account. Do you want to allow it? And you are actually given a chance to say, yes, I would like to allow it, or no, I would like to deny it. And this was kind of the core idea of the original OAuth specs. So going back in time a little bit to OAuth 2.0, when it was originally created, this is a simplified version of the flow, and I'm not going to go through the whole thing here. There's plenty of other resources you can read to learn about that. But the thing I do want to call out here is that each of these legs of the flow, they are from and to these different roles in the flow. And as the OAuth specs have evolved, there have been a lot of new extensions that protect various parts of the flow in various ways. The short version of this is the client application is going to, using the browser, redirect the user to the authorization server, where it's going to then redirect back with this authorization code, which the client can exchange, that middle diagonal line, for a token, which you can then use that token, or like a hotel key, to go and access data at the API. The API needs to know how to validate the token, which is the next vertical line on the right. So OAuth was originally RFC 6749, the core spec, and it defined this flow as well as a couple other flows. And it also needed to define something about how access tokens were used. And the original spec actually left out access tokens entirely because of some interesting history there. But the one that kind of won out was this idea of bearer tokens, which just means if you have the token, you can use it, just like a hotel key. If you pick up a hotel key on the floor, you can go and use it, and it doesn't matter that you weren't issued that key. Bearer tokens are a different RFC, and that spec defines a few different ways of using it. Later, it became apparent that we needed some recommendations for how to do OAuth in new kinds of environments that were emerging, like mobile apps and single-page apps. And there's a particular part of the flow that was vulnerable to some interesting and subtle attacks that a new RFC was created to solve, called PXE. PXE then later was an RFC was created to describe how to apply that on a mobile app, as well as other recommendations for mobile apps. And that eventually the implicit flow, which was kind of a workaround to avoid the authorization code and avoid PXE, which was really only created because some browsers that are now extremely old couldn't do cross-origin requests. That no longer served any purpose, so it's been taken out of the spec by the security BCP, which also recommends not using the password grant because that wasn't really OAuth either. The security BCP has a bunch of other recommendations in it as well. And by now, you're probably thinking, hey, this is a lot of RFCs. What am I even looking at? What even is OAuth? And it is kind of a maze, and there's a lot to it, and there's a lot of specs. But if you actually look at kind of the best version of what you should be doing now with OAuth, it actually isn't as bad as it sounds. If you take out all the things that have been crossed out by the security BCP and add in a couple of the specs that are pretty much agreed upon as standard, you get a shorter list than that mess. And that's really what OAuth 2.1 is meant to do. So OAuth 2.1 is meant to collect the best practices of OAuth 2 and just give it a name so that we can refer to it as the best version of OAuth 2. So OAuth 2.1, still in progress. The goal is to consolidate these specs, remove deprecated features, capture the best practices now of OAuth 2, and give it a name that can be referred to. Another important one is adding references to extensions that didn't exist originally. There's been a lot of new work that is hard to find because it's hard to just wade through these RFCs. So there's now a lot of inline references to saying, if you care about this problem, go read this other RFC for linking out to these extensions that didn't exist. A couple things that OAuth 2.1 is not doing. There is no new behavior defined by OAuth 2.1, which basically means if you are doing OAuth 2.0 and you're following the best practice guidance in all the documents, that you are already doing OAuth 2.1. So you don't have to go and update things. So what I want to do now is talk about some of the recent extensions that are now being referenced, linked out to from OAuth 2.1, and talk about how they fit into the flows. A relatively recent extension, JOT profile for access tokens, defines a way for authorization servers to issue structured access tokens, and it talks about the claims inside them. Access tokens don't have to be JSON Web Tokens. It's a convenient method to do that, and there are a lot of reasons why you would want to do that, and there are some reasons why you don't. If you do want to do it, there is now an RFC to follow that talks about the best way to do it. So that's protecting this leg between these two different parties. The JOT will look like a JOT. They're going to be long strings now, and it's still a bearer token because still anybody who can steal this can use it, but at least now we have like a structured set of claims in the token to talk about who it was issued to, the lifetime application that was issued to, and things like that. There's also pushed authorization requests, which is it adds a new leg to the flow, actually. It starts the flow, instead of using a redirect, it starts it with a post request, which actually solves a lot of problems and cleans things up quite nicely. So this one is really, it's mainly a negotiation between the client and the authorization server. Definitely worth looking into supporting because it does add a nice layer of security. Normally, the request, like describing what the client is trying to do, like I'm trying to access your contacts, or here's the redirect URL and all that, would go in the front channel in the URL, which means that the user can see it, the user can modify it, other things, other software on the machine can see it. So push authorization request starts the flow from the back channel where instead of this GET request, the back channel is where all that same information is sent, and then it just gets a reference to that data that it uses in the front channel. So it's nice that it's actually also not a huge amount of extra work to support. There's another way that we can protect the front channel using JSON Web Tokens. This is RFC 9101, JOT authorization requests. The idea here, again, because we don't want to let the user or the browser modify the authorization request, this is another way to encapsulate it and sign it that you can use in the front channel. So instead of putting all these, response type and client ID and stuff in the query string, you put it into a JOT, sign the JOT, that goes in the front channel. RFC 9207, this one's getting even more recent now. Authorization server issue or identification, that's a lot of words. That is protecting the redirect back from the authorization server to the client. I think actually my line on the slide is in the wrong spot. It should be on the redirect back. This is basically because there's, if a client interacts with more than one authorization server, so for example, if you have sign in with Facebook, sign in with Google, sign in with Twitter, there's some subtle mix-up attacks that are possible, which this spec solves. And this spec is a tiny little building block that just says, this is the server that issued this response, and the client can check it and then avoid the attack. And the good thing, again, is it's simple to implement on both ends of the spectrum. So those are some RFCs. Now I want to go over some of the nearly final specifications. So these are now getting into the more bleeding edge that are not quite done yet. We're still going through the process. Although actually this slide is now out of date because yesterday this one was published. So there is now an RFC number for rich authorization requests. Rich authorization requests, you could think of it as structured scopes. So scope describes what type of data the application is requesting access to. So it could be things like, I want to access your contacts. That's a pretty straightforward scope. It's just a big category of things. But what if you wanted to be able to request access to specific resources, like authorize a transaction of a certain dollar amount or over a certain dollar amount, or to or from specific bank accounts? There's nowhere in scopes that you can really squeeze that. You could twist it around to make it work, but it's not really meant for that. Scopes were meant for these broad categories of things. Rich authorization requests is meant for doing things like a request that the app is making to transfer $100 from this account to this account, or authorize this app to make transfers over $10,000. So it describes the structure that apps can use to make that request. This was in progress last year as well, but now it actually has its RFC number. This one is also very nearly done. JOT response for token introspection. Token introspection is the idea that the resource server, the API that gets an API request, it needs to know, is this token valid? How is it going to know, is the token valid? Well, if you're using JOT tokens, you can just look at the JOT and validate the signature. If you're not using JOT tokens, or if you're using JOT tokens and you don't want to look at the signature, you can use the introspection endpoint at the authorization server. So that would be a post request from the API to the OAuth server saying, hey, OAuth server, is this token valid? Well, the response normally is just yes or no, and the API will just carry on. The JOT response provides that response that is signed, which means it can actually be logged and later used to prove that the authorization server did actually say this token was valid. And that can be useful in certain scenarios for compliance and things like that. Step-up auth challenge. This one has gone very quickly through the process overall. And the idea here is when a client makes a request to an API, let's say the API decides that it no longer trusts the integrity of the particular token. It might say that the token was issued too long ago, or the token, you're about to do something that's higher value, so we need you to step up and reauthorize or reauthenticate the user in some way. So this spec describes the headers and the response that the API can send back to the client saying, we need you to go through a new OAuth flow again. So typical uses of this would be like, the client user logged in using a banking app, whatever, browsing their transactions, no big deal, but then they want to go do a bank transfer of $10,000 between accounts. That's a high-value transaction. We should probably make sure that the user is authenticated again, or maybe you want to challenge them for multi-factor auth at that point, but not when they first log in. So this is a specific error header that can be used to tell the client to go through an OAuth flow again. This draft, it did make its way very quickly through the process. It was adopted by the working group just last year, and now it is pending final reviews. It'll have an RFC number very soon. A big category of things that I would like to talk about are sender-constrained access tokens. I mentioned at the beginning that bearer tokens are kind of the way that access tokens work right now, which means that if you can grab a token, you can use it, which means if you can steal a token, you can act as that user or as that application. And it's a real problem. There's a lot of very public, well-documented cases, not to pick on anybody in particular, but a lot of public cases of this being a problem. In particular, there's a whole scheme of these going around on YouTube where the attackers will get a YouTube channel owner, manager, to install malware on their computer through various social engineering techniques. That malware will then steal any tokens available on that machine for their YouTube account, and then it'll just take over the channel. And it usually ends up with live streaming cryptocurrency scams because they're apparently very profitable. So the problem with this is that it's a bearer token. And again, back to the hotel analogy, if you can find a hotel key, you can use it just as well as the person it was originally issued to. There's nothing protecting the use of the token. So ideally, we need to solve this. We would like sender-constrained tokens, which means if you steal a token, you would not be able to use it. And this is what it looks like to get a token and use it right now. You do the OAuth flow, you get the auth code, you get a token, and then you just use it in the header, which means if you can steal the token, you can use it, because it's the same string that's in the response used in the request. So what we're going to do is we're going to try to find some solution to authenticate the instance of the client that is making the request. And this is where things kind of get messy. We need some sort of authentication of the client instance, and what do those actually mean? And it turns out there's been a lot of attempts over the years at this. There is an RFC, mutual TLS, that does solve this problem. However, it's not super widely actually used for a number of reasons. There's Depop in the OAuth working group, which is very near publication, and that binds an access token to a private key. There's signed HTTP requests, which is in the HTTP working group, which is not really about proof of possession of access tokens, but you could apply it there if you wanted to. And there's a couple failed expired drafts that just never got off the ground. So really what you should be looking at now are these top three and looking at the trade-offs there. But the main one that is farthest along and most mature and probably has the most potential here is Depop, which was specifically created for OAuth 2. It is not a general purpose signing mechanism. Really important there. It is made specifically for proof of possession for OAuth access tokens. And it was also created specifically to be able to be implemented in JavaScript for browsers. So the way this works is when the client goes and gets a token with that authorization code, it's going to also include a Depop proof, which is going to be a JOT with a bunch of detailed claims. Go read the spec for the details. And then when the client goes to use the access token, it has to include a Depop proof again. Basically, with the same private key, create a new signed JOT. And that way, the authorization server can be looking at the signature of that JOT and make sure that it's the same piece of software that requested the token, and the same piece of software is now using the token. Another piece of new work is selective disclosures, which this is a big topic, and I think there might be a session about it here later, but the short version is right now, JOTs are either entirely encrypted or only signed, and there's no real middle mix of them. And what SD-JOT, selective disclosure JOT does is it means the issuer of a JOT, the creator of a JOT, can obscure the claims and later prove the values. It's a neat little trick. Don't have time to go into the details of how it works now, but you can read the spec or look up other talks about it. This was proposed just last year, and it's gone through a lot of iterations. A lot of work has been happening over the last year on this, and it's coming along very nicely, but it's still pretty early days in terms of how specs go. This is kind of what it looks like. You create these, you take the value, you create this claim with a salt in it, and then you basically C4 encode it, and then include that and hash it and include that hashed value in the JOT so that no one can look at this. You can't look at this and reverse the value, but I can later provide the proof that I did in fact create that hash of that value. So lots of work here, lots of exciting stuff. I keep a list up to date on OAuth.net of all this stuff that's going on. You can always refer there to find links out to the latest RFCs or these in-progress things and even more in-progress work that I didn't necessarily get to cover. And with that, I will leave you there, and thank you all very much for your time. And I think we have about 1 minute for questions, so I don't know if someone has a really good question, feel free to ask. Otherwise, I will be at the Okta booth later today, so feel free to find me there, and we can keep talking about this, because I can talk about this all day long, I swear. Okay, one question.
I got a good one.
Okay.
All of these RFCs are coming out, and one of the problems I've personally experienced is between vendors, it's a very splotchy implementation between RFCs, and I will have opcode flows, even almost standard ones that work on one vendor, but then another vendor implements something just slightly different, and it doesn't work anymore, and the apps have to change their code. How do we avoid that?
So the question was, there's a lot of RFCs, and a lot of vendors have implemented various subsets of them. So how do you, as a client developer, figure out how to know what to support where, and how do we solve this? It is a hard problem, and a lot of these RFCs are optional intentionally, only if you have a certain problem. But that is one of the goals of OAuth 2.1 at least, which should clean up a lot of that base layer stuff, that sort of foundation. So hopefully, once we finalize OAuth 2.1, the vendors will say, yes, we support OAuth 2.1, and that should have more meaning than previous what supporting OAuth 2 meant before. So that's my answer. But yeah, thanks. I think we're out of time. Thank you all. I'll be at the Okta booth this afternoon, so feel free to find me there. Thanks.